class, in this lecture, we are going to look at memory. So we say, well, we define memory as the active system that receives, stores, organizes, alters, and recovers information. So basically, memory is just that. It's that stored information in our brains. And so we know those neurotransmitters taking in outside information, that outside stimuli, sensory information, and it gets as it goes through the neural pathways to our brains, it gets filtered and it gets sorted out, and it gets stored into long-term memory. And it may sound simple, but memory is actually very complex. It's very dynamic, and there are a lot of factors involved. I would say, even at the more basic level, before even the inner workings of our brain, memory is important because it's a way that we survive. So it's something that all species and life forms have, because you have to be able to remember just for that, so that you can survive. You got to remember where your food is. You have to remember where your water is. You have to remember, where your home is, and if you don't remember any of those, your chances of survival get limited. And then when we start moving up the evolutionary chain and get to more complex life forms like us, human beings, we see that memory is important because it's a way that we form social bonds, and that's actually something we see in other primates too. Some of the non-human primates, and then the lower simian orders there, the social bonding is very important to us. And it's because we're social creatures, we need each other to survive, so we have to be able to remember things. And then it's kind of a safety thing too. We have to kind of remember those bad things so that we remember to avoid them, right? So when it comes to our brain, we know our hippocampus is involved in the memory process. Excuse me. The hippocampus is, it's taking in that sensory information from the outside environment, encodes it, and changes it into something that our cerebral cortex can then store, retain, and retrieve. And so we say the neurotransmitters involved in that are acetylcholine, I believe is how you say that. And we say that they need nerve impulses. Basically, it's just talking about that electrical charge, right, from those synapses and our neurotransmitters. Remember, it's all that a chemical, electrical kind of type inner workings there in our brain. So that's nerve impulses is what we're talking about, just that little electric charge that gets through. And it's also important to know about memory because of the fact that we can forget, and that is becoming more of a problem in our culture because we do see things like memory loss and dementia on the rise. However, it is a myth that everybody who gets old gets Alzheimer's. Getting old does not mean that you lose your memory. I mean, we don't really know what causes Alzheimer's, so maybe if it's more genetic as to why some people are prone to losing memory as opposed to others, but not everybody that gets old loses their memory. Sometimes it gets a little harder to get those neural pathways working and remembering something, but we don't all get that degenerative disease there that is Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is bad because we don't know how to cure or prevent it. We don't know what causes it, and it's very irreversible. So once those neural pathways get clipped to the point that there's nothing left, it's well, I don't know if you guys have ever seen anybody with Alzheimer's, but it gets bad. They just have no recollection of anything. But on a positive note, we do know that there are plenty of scientists and doctors that are working on, investigating Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Diana Woodruff Park there at Temple University is working on a vaccine, and some interesting work that they are doing there. So I will make sure that I put those links in the comments under the video. So I would suggest go checking her page out there. And then the other link that I have there there is the Discovering Psychology series that Dr. Zimbardo, who did the famous Stanford prison experiment, he is the one that hosts those series. And so really good, really educational, pretty funny too, especially now, because when you watch them, they were like made back in the 70s and 80s, and so it's just kind of funny to see how people look and how they dressed and stuff like that. So alright, so when it comes to memory, we usually classify it as 3 stages based on Atkinson and Shiffrin's model here. So that model is those stages, are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So remember, we're constantly inundated by outside stimulation and stuff going on around us, and our neurons are picking, and synapses are picking up all that information and filtering it through our central nervous systems up into our brain, and then it's going back out and telling us what to do or what it is. And so at the very, very beginning stages of that sensory input, it's very fleeting. So like say maybe you hear a bird, but you don't really pay attention to it. It's just something kind of like out of the corner of your eye type thing. That's a good analogy, so it's something very quick, and you tend to like, kind of, blow it off for the most part, unless it's something, meaningful, alright? And we'll get to that. That's important. Alright, so the key processes with memory is that we are able to encode, store, and retrieve that information. If we can't do those 3 things, we don't have any memory. So, the encoding is just converting that information into something usable. Storage is just, putting that information somewhere so we can then get it later when we need it. That would be then the retrieval part. Alright, so sensory memory, it's that exact copy of incoming information for a few seconds or less. And it's, like I said, very, very fleeting. And it's usually something that we see or that we hear. And a lot of times we're really unaware of a lot of that sensory information that is coming in. And so, it's only the selective stuff, the stuff that is selective and meaningful, that starts to get transferred to that short-term memory. And so, since sensory memory is largely based on what we see or hear, I would say taste might be another one too, but we'll just stick with auditory and visual. We say that sensory memory can be iconic or echoic. So if it's iconic, that's that visual imagery you get stored there for about half a minute, or half a second, excuse me. And then if it's echoic, that's the sound. And so it's just, maybe a brief, like that. You hear the bird chirp, and maybe, your brain kind of like echoes it for a second, and then it's gone, and you don't really think about that bird again. And, unless that bird was, say, I hate to use this, but I will, that bird was going to attack you. That's meaningful information, so that would be something that you would pay attention to protect yourself. And then, the way that would then get transferred to your long-term memory is that it would just make you, be more aware of maybe that particular type of bird. I don't like that analogy because I love animals, and so I don't want you to think birds are going to attack you. They won't, for the most part. Next, we have short-term memory. So, like I said, we get that sensory information that comes in. The stuff that gets our attention then starts working its way down that neural pathway, and it, comes into our short-term memory there. I think in many ways, I think of our short-term memory kind of like Freud's subconscious, that mental waiting room. So that's kind of what our short-term memory is too. It's so, we're usually aware of that short-term memory. So it's something that, we're actively kind of, we have our consciously engaged with whatever that information coming in is. And so it's just like that. It's, it kind of hangs out there, and then once again, what information and turns out to be meaningful, then goes on to the next stage, to long term, and then what's not meaningful kind of gets kicked back out there. And so when it comes to how that information is turned into something useful, at least at this stage, in our short-term memory, is by encoding, and it's phonetic encoding, so it's usually sound, so it's hear things. And we say that our short-term memory is part of our working memory, and then like that, it's like a mental scratch pad. So it's like, as you're taking notes, that's kind of what your short-term memory, it's like you're taking notes, and it's just kind of writing down the little bits and pieces that is, that you're paying attention to. And so you can be easily distracted while our information while in short-term memory. So and because of that, when it's information that we do indeed need to store into our long-term memory, we have to have some way to be able to, keep that in our short term so that it does go to our long term. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. So we say that usually when it comes to our short-term memory, we have limited storage capacity. So in a short amount of time, we can only learn a short amount of information. And usually we say I say the magic number of those little bits of information that we can learn at once is about 7. And it would be plus or minus 2, but it's mostly 7. And we do get information when it comes in. It is in these little bites. So, once again, these little meaningful, it's something that has gotten our attention. And so we're starting to pay more attention, applying some meaning to it, associated it with something else, so that it's starting to get ingrained into our long-term memory there. And so the way that we know that the storage capacity of our short-term memory here, this kind of attention span is what we could say too, is by these things we call digit span. And that would be like if I were to read off a list of numbers to you, and you couldn't write them down. You just had to sit there and pay attention to this list of numbers. And I'd probably read off a list about 12 or 15 numbers, and then I would ask you, to recall those numbers for me. Most of the time, most of us are going to remember the very beginning because, that's when we're paying attention, those first few seconds, so remember those first few numbers, and then we usually kind of taper off there in the middle, and then once it gets to the end, our attention is kind of snapped back in, and we tend to remember that information. So usually that information in the middle seems to get lost, but of course that's just this is just a mean there, so I mean by no means representative of everybody. It's just kind of the it's just kind of that general information that but for the most part, it unless you're kind of a savant, which is when you can remember every single moment of your life from birth, most of us tend to not be able to pay attention to that stuff in the middle there. And it doesn't matter if we were to, if I read you that list of numbers and then asked you to go backwards or read it in the exact order that I did, we'll still see kind of that middle part tapered out there. And so that's why, in order for that information then to be modified and reorganized to, to be able to be stored in our long-term memory, we have this thing called recoding, and that's just what it is. It's just getting that information organized, modifying, associating it with something else. So since it comes into our short-term memory in these little bites of meaningful information, we have what we call information chunks. And basically that's where those little bytes, they all get grouped into a larger one. So think about like the file tree there on your computer, and you have those different folders, right? You have a folder for like music, folder for pictures, and then maybe like folder for your schoolwork. And so as information comes, and then what do? You put all your pictures go in one folder, or your music goes in, and so on and so forth there, right? All that information gets grouped into those folders. That's kind of in a way, it's very similar to what's going on in our brain as information is stored. And in developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, he came up with the idea of stages of cognitive development that we all go through when we are little kids there. And he says that some of the first ways that we start processing and understanding information is by these things called schemas. So schemas, it's just that. It's these little bits of information that we put into these kind of folders, or we group together in these folders, and then that's what the schema is. So that would be that information chunk. So think about it as the first time a baby sees a dog. What does baby say? Baby says, oh, what's that? And you say, that's a dog. Dog, woof woof. Dogs go woof woof. Dogs have paws. They have a tail. They have a wet nose, and they're furry, right? So, so all those little parts that make up the dog, those are those little bites of information that then get chunked together so that, that memory of the dog then starts getting formed. So then what happens when baby sees a cat? Cats look similar to a dog, so that baby associates that with the dog and says, oh, dog, woof woof. And you say, no, not dog, cat, meow meow, right? And so then baby starts chunking that information together. Okay, well, kind of like a dog, it has wet nose, paws, fluffy, has a tail, but it says meow meow. So it gets chunked into its own folder. It gets chunked into the cat folder. And then basically, if you just work up the animal chain there, then horse to birds to reptiles, elephants, each of those those traits that makes up those animals, they get stored in those chunks. And then of course, as we age and get older, those schemas get more complex. And then, like I said, in order for that information to get once that information gets our attention, and in order for us to get it stored to our long-term memory, we do a few things, and it's mostly through rehearsal is how it gets stored there. So, maintenance rehearsal, that is when you're just, silently repeat that information, and, you repeat it for a few minutes, and if you don't repeat it, you usually, it gets kicked out of your short-term memory, right? And then we also have what we call rote rehearsal, and it's using repetition to transfer information to the long-term memory, but we say it's not very effective. And basically, the difference here is that with that rote rehearsal, that's that really fast repetition. When you try to do it really fast, you repeat it so fast that that it doesn't really have time to get into your memory. It's kind of best that maintenance, we call it. The difference with the maintenance there is that you kind of give yourself a little bit of time, right? You repeat the information, and maybe say you only repeat it 3 times. Like me, that's my magic number. If I repeat something to myself silently 3 times, for the most part, it is in my long-term memory. But now, if I sit there and I repeat it 3 times, very, very quickly, or if I repeat it 20 times to myself, in a rapid succession of 10 seconds, then no. And the reason is because you're doing it so quickly that it's not having time to get imprinted. It's not really going up that neural pathways there. And like I said, so what I was talking about there was Piaget and schemas and the information about information chunks, no pun, association. The way that we get that information into our long-term memory is through association. And so we call that elaborative processing, because we're taking in that new information, we're linking it to existing memories and information and knowledge that we already have, and that associates classical conditioning. We learn the best when we're able to associate, right, guys? And then that takes us to long-term memory. So, anything that is stored in a long-term memory is meaningful information, so it's something that is going to be helpful or useful to us, something that is going to be contingent upon our survival, our social bonds, so it's meaningful. And we say that long-term memories are only rarely permanent, and And basically what we're talking about, basically what that means is that, you know, if it's in long-term memory, that means it's permanent, right? But, you know, a lot of times information gets stored into our long-term memory, and, you know, maybe it was so long ago that we just can't quite, you know, it's down in like the sub basement there of our cerebral cortex, and so, you know, it takes a long time for that neural pathway to wake back up and get back into our waking consciousness, right? And so basically what it's saying there by saying it's only rarely permanent, I believe it's referring more to like savants, like people who remember every moment, every single detail of their life since birth. You know, that would be like real permanent memory there, because they remember everything, and that's extremely rare. And like I said, that's called a savant, and that's actually different from photographic and idyllic memory there. And you know, it doesn't mean that information isn't in a long-term memory. It's just, like I said, it's just that sometimes it's just harder for us to pull it up. That is something with age. The more you age, the more information you get stored in your brain. You know, sometimes your brain does have a little trouble like figuring out, remembering which folder that it put that information in. And then and then, of course, you know, with memory loss, too, that can affect our long-term memory. Sometimes, you know, like with Alzheimer's, that information just, you know, well, actually, with Alzheimer's, what happens is that those neural pathways, it's a disease, you know, something comes in and attacks those pathways and kills them. So there's no link, you know, you've got this gap to that memory, and you can't get it back, right? But for the most part, like I said, with most of us, we have so much stored in there that it just kind of, you know, some stuff gets harder to recall than others. And so, you know, once again, association. So when we can associate information with something we already know, something that we remember, you know, that helps keep those neural pathways a little bit stronger, right? And then we have to be careful about false memories too. And sometimes false memories are, we call them pseudo memories, and it's just that. It's, you know, where you believe something to be true and accurate, but it's just not. And then you also have things like false memories that come in the form of just like source confusion, and that's maybe where the origins of a memory are just misremembered. So, like say, maybe history class, the first two presidents there, George Washington, John Adams, and maybe you get them confused, and you're like, no, it was John Adams was the first president of the United States, and you know, that would be like a source confusion, or you know, like maybe you learn about the Civil War, but for some reason your brain just misread what the dates were there, and so you think the Civil War was from these dates when it was really these. So, you know, stuff like that where you just can't quite remember the origin of what was going on there when you first learned that information. Alright, so a way that we get those memories, get that information back out of our long-term memory is, you know, once again, it's through association. You know, we have to like have some kind of sensory information come in that sparks that memory there. So, you know, we have to look at it. Remember, it's going through that neural pathway, so it is a network of network of those neural connections and then linked ideas there. So I think of that, you know, kind of like I said, kind of like that file tree on your folder. You know, you have the part of your brain, it's like the main memory, and then everything else is kind of put into those different folders and along different pathways there. And so reintegration is how we recall memories, and that's just, you know, when you start with one memory, and then what does that do? That then lights up that pathway, and you remember something else. So maybe like you think about something that some event from your childhood, and say maybe like a Christmas, and you think about that one Christmas when you were 5, and then, you know, it makes you think about, oh yeah, at that Christmas maybe it was your first bike, and then thinking of getting your first bike that then led to, you know, that neural path, the way there of the first time you rode your bike, and then that leads into, you know, all of those experiences you had with that bike, because, you know, that's that folder and all the different little files that are stored in it. And then we also have things that we call cognitive interview, and this is where you use various cues and strategies to just improve your memory. And as you see there, it says eyewitness memory, and so that is used a lot with psychologists and with people who have been involved in you know, something that requires them to come into court and testify in front of a jury. And so a lot of the times you use cues, so, you know, like think about watching, you know, Law and Order or something like that. What are those attorneys, they like, now recall the night, and do you remember what so and so, you know, what was the weather like that night? You know, those would be type of cognitive interview type questions that then help you spark your memory. And then when it comes to our long-term memory, we kind of break it apart into different types there. So we have procedural memory, and this is kind of our skill set. These are those memories for those conditioned responses and for the skills that we need to learn. So this would be like, you know, learning to ride a bike, learning how to walk, you know, learning how to do your job, you know, those would all be that procedural memory. And then we have that declarative memory, and so that is more that factual stuff. So that's more the stuff that we learn in school, we learn from other people, you know, declarative type stuff. And we break that down into somatic and episodic. So somatic is just that's more what we use for those impersonal facts and everyday knowledge. Somatic is kind of related to just words. So, you know, that's just that, you know, our normal, I'd say our normal conscious memory, you know, just those things we you know, we wake up every morning, we remember to do certain things in the morning, and, you know, that's all based on our somatic memory there. And then we have those episodic memory, and that is when, like the example I gave earlier, you remember your Christmas when you were 5 years old. That's when you get those personal experiences, and you have them with those specific times and places there. All right, so when it comes to measuring memory, basically what we're looking at there are the different ways that that information comes back to us, right? And sometimes we have trouble with that, and, you know, you have that tip of the tongue type of memory there, and it's when you know that you know something, but it's just that you just can't quite get it out. It's like, you know, you can't just quite, you know, your brain can't quite remember where that neural pathway is, but you're like, I know what it is. Say, like, you're watching a movie and you see an actor, because I think my husband and I do this. You see the actor and you're like, I know who that is. He's in so many movies, but I just can't quite remember his name. That's that tip of the tongue thing. And then we also, you know, way to measure memory, and this would be kind of in the process of acquiring that information to make it a memory. It's kind of based on feeling, kind of based on knowing, maybe a little bit of gut reaction there. And basically with that, it's kind of your ability, our ability to know, decide kind of beforehand whether or not we're going to remember something. So think about that, you know, depending on what mood we're in, emotional state, what our temperance is, you know, we may not just feel like learning that information to remember it. Say maybe you've had a real stressful day, and then you have to go into your college class, and your teacher's inundating you with all this information, and you're just like, I'm not going to get any of this tonight. I just don't feel like it. Right? That happens sometimes. And then we also have recall, and that's just when, you know, that direct retrieval of facts, and just like I said, we seem to kind of taper off in the middle of a list, but we seem to always remember the first and last things there. And then we also have recognition and relearning. So once again, that's important to our memory. It's important that we can recognize and remember stuff. And then it's important sometimes that we relearn something. So, we relearn something. So say we learned something and, we just kind of forgot that information, forgot that skill set. And so then we relearn it. So maybe, it's like you go to take a college class and you haven't taken a college class in say 10 years, and so you think you're not good at writing, so you would take a class first on writing so that you can relearn how to write academically. Relearning is also important because, that's the biggest thing about being human. Being human means that we can learn, and that's a good thing because it means that we can relearn. We often say that we repeat, especially with history, that we are doomed to repeat ourselves. And, maybe in many ways so. We won't argue that, we won't debate that in this class. But my point is that it's not true that we can't relearn something. That saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Yes, you can. And, you can take something and teach somebody another way to be. We see that a lot when it comes to things like mental disorders and treating those disorders. It's really just that, just retraining somebody how to just be human and function in daily life. So that is definitely important to us there. And then we also have recognition, and recognition is important because that then is how we do indeed know that we have remembered something, that we have correctly learned something, and it's just being able to correctly identify it. And sometimes, though, we do have distractors, or we can have false positives. And a lot of the times, if you recognize something, you know what it is. But sometimes, those distractors, like think about it, a multiple choice test. Sometimes you'll have like 2 answers that are just totally wrong. You'll have one answer that's right, and then you'll have one answer that looks right, but there's just like one word change from the right answer. And so, sometimes we fail to recognize that the little semantics there, and so we get that false positive, and we're like, no, that one's right too. And then the teacher's like, not because of that one specific word. And I'm like, oh, that would be a false positive type moment there. Alright, so once again, a biggest thing about learning about memory is that, why it's important is because we forget. If we forget too much, then, it affects our survival, it affects our relationships with other. And in forgetting, since what we do know about memory, scientists have come up with this curve of forgetting, and it's basically just a graph that shows the amount of memory information remembered after varying lengths of time. So it's going to be like, kind of categorized on different types, say like school information, personal information, and then, how long it takes you to go about remembering that. And then sometimes to test memory, that we have what we call nonsense syllables, which are just meaningless 3-letter words there. Sorry, to make sure my goat's not in the road. 3-letter words, and it just kind of tests our ability to learn and forget. Alright, so then when it comes to memory and how that information starts to get turned into that useful and meaningful information, we have implicit and explicit memory. So the explicit, those are those experiences that they're explicit. They're the ones that we are consciously and constantly kind of reminded of. And then we also have implicit memory, and that would be like what Freud and Jung talk about, maybe like that latent content that we hold in our unconscious. Maybe it's something that we've repressed, something we've suppressed, and so we don't just quite remember that happened. And for the most part, a lot of times that happens when there's something very traumatic, when something very traumatic has happened to somebody. You see a more implicit memory involved, because they tend to, suppress that down in their unconscious. And so sometimes you have to do like priming, and so you use cues to activate those hidden memories, and things like hypnosis can be used to activate those hidden memories. But we have to be careful with that, because sometimes with priming and with hypnosis, you can provide false clues and create false memories. It just kind of depends on the state of mind of the person that you're using that on, if that makes any sense there. And then when a memory does not fully form, we call that encoding failure, and that would be where you think that somebody looks like somebody else, or you think that maybe all people look alike, because you just don't pay enough attention to spot those differences. All right, so that's what happens when information coming in doesn't properly get changed into something useful or meaningful. So what happens then when it gets into our storage and that fails? So we have some different ways that our memory, that our storage capacity for memories can fail. We say memory traces, and basically this is we do actually see physical changes in our nerve cells and those neurotransmitters in our brain activity when memories are stored. So we see, those parts of the brain lighting up, maybe the hippocampus there lighting up, or amygdala lighting up. And then and so it's like, you see like little, kind of think of it like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen any CAT scans, but just think of it maybe like stars or something. You just kind of little twinkle star, little trace, and those are like, those fleeting memories, right, guys? When you're like, I kind of remember that, and it's just like, half a little star lights up there. And then what happens, the more you don't think about that information, then that memory can become weaker. So those traces become weaker until they start to fade. And then like I said, if your memory you get the degenerative disease, then you really have that decay, because then you get to death of those nerve cells, right? And then we also have disuse, and that basically is just that some memory traces, they kind of fade over time because they're just not used or retrieved. And once again, this is those neural pathways, they get pruned to the point they're just dead. All right. So when it comes to retrieving our memories in our long-term memory there, we have a few different ways we do that. We have availability, and so that's just, you can't have the memory available if it's not stored in your long-term memory. You have to have accessibility, this is in order to get that memory back. So, you have to be able to remember where that information was stored, which file, which folder you put that file in, right? And then, like I said, sometimes we have information in our long-term memory, but, it's just not acceptable. We just, like I said, it's way, way down there in the sub-basement, and we just, with all these stacks and stacks of boxes and file folders, and we're just like, oh, geez, I know it's in here somewhere, but I'm just not sure where. And, you may hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt, and you still just can't find it. But it doesn't mean that it's gone. It's just that, you just can't find it. And so that's where, things like priming and memory cues can come into play there, and can be helpful things, because it does help you, remember. And once again, it's through association. You got to associate it. And then when it comes to how we retrieve our memories, we have the state-dependent learning. And this is actually kind of funny. So basically, in order to remember something, it is contingent upon, our mind and body and emotions at the time that we're learning it. So like I said, if you come into class, you've had a real long, stressful day, you've kind of already decided, you're tired, maybe your body hurts, and you're probably just not going to remember information that well at that time, right? But when you come in and you're all alert and you feel good, then what happens? You're able to you're more attentive, you take in that information, and then you're able to then recall that information. Now here's the kind of funny thing with state dependent learning is that basically what they're saying, so put it in this context. So if you go to study for a test, the way that you are going to be successful on your test is if you're in the same state of mind as you were when you were studying. So technically, if you're drunk while you study for your test and you feel like, that's helping you to remember the information, then you need to be drunk when you go take the test to recall the information. If you smoke marijuana when you study for your test and you're in that altered state of consciousness, if it's helpful, now this is only under the context of this is actually helping your memory, but if smoking marijuana before your test helps you remember that information, then you have to be high when you go to take the test so that you can retrieve that information. And so it just tends to work that way. If you're high when you're studying, drunk when you're studying, then you'll remember it better when you're high, when you're drunk. So, take that for whatever for whatever grain of salt that it's worth, but it's kind of funny. It tends to make me laugh when I hear it in that context. And then sometimes new memories, as we take in new information, that might affect some of our older memories. And then, kind of like I said, the older you get, the more experiences you have, the more information you learn, all that's kind of getting stored and stacked upon each other in your brain there. And so, sometimes it is hard to get to the bottom of the stack. And so with that tendency to new memories to kind of and impede our retrieval of old memories, we say we have retroactive inference and then proactive inference. And retroactive is just that. It's just kind of it's saying it's retroactive because it's interfering with your ability to go back into time and remember, to go back in your mind's time and retrieve that memory. And then proactive interference, and this is where maybe things that you have learned before interfere with that old information. So it's kind of like a conflicting information. So instead of being able to get to that memory, you kind of have something else that's kind of like blocking the way. So maybe you're trying to remember about your bike on your 5th birthday, but maybe memory of how annoying your little brother comes in or something, and so that's all your so it's like your little brother in the way of that memory. Hey, think about me. That's kind of what we're talking about. It's just something like, hey, no, don't think about that. Think about this over here. And so then you kind of forget about that other one there. Then we also have positive and negative transfer. And with positive transfer, that is where you learn something and then it actually helps you with something else that you know. So off the top of my head, like a good, well, here's one in my personal life. I like to paint, just artistically kind of doodle and paint. And then I also paint people's houses, so paint walls and trim and stuff like that. Well, and they're different, it's different ways you paint, you kind of different kind of paint tools you use in many respects. But, and the more I learn how to paint houses and do that the right way, the techniques involved with that, the more I'm able then to take that and transfer it into my kind of just artistic doodling around type of paintings that I do. So it would be something like that, or I'm trying to think of another, just that. You learn something, you're like, oh, this information is going to help me in this aspect of my life too. That's positive transfer. And then sometimes we have negative transfer, and that's just where maybe you have a task that will conflict with learning or performing another task. I would say this probably negative transfer probably tends to work more when we are in those fixed mindsets, when, you know, we have consciously told ourselves that we're not going to learn something. We know the way that it's going to be done, and so we're not even if that is a, you know, more efficient and better way to do it, we're not going to budge. We're right, and we're just not going to do it, right? That would be negative transfer. Alright, and then of course, like I've already said, we also have repression and suppression, you know, just like what Freud talked about a lot there, and with his defense mechanisms. And we know repression is just, you know, those kind of really negative experience that we just don't want to remember, you know, that we do forget those. So, you know, once again, it's meaningful, and the meaningfulness there is that we're motivated to forget, because it's just something that just, you know, painful, embarrassing, or is just not serving to, you know, our journey of self-actualization there. So we forget it, and we want to forget it, right? And then we also have a suppression, and that's where, you know, suppression is just you're trying to keep it out of your conscious mind. And so this would probably, I would say, you know, break it up into the 3 parts of the mind there. Freud's 3 parts of the mind. This would probably mean like something, you know, you're like, oh, I don't want to think about that. So you kind of push it down into your subconscious, and then, you know, if you keep pushing it, it gets repressed, so it goes down into your unconscious. But I would say suppression is kind of more, like I said, a little bit, it's more of a conscious thing. Definitely, yeah, like I have there, more conscious there. Alright, so we already know that our cerebral cortex and our hippocampus play a role in memory. And I briefly mentioned our amygdala. And so we're just going to take a few minutes and look at these different parts of the brain involved in memory. So we have the cerebellum. And we know that the cerebellum, it's what helps us create those implicit memories. It helps us with those procedural memories. It helps us with being, you know, learning motor skills. And then, of course, it is part of the association process in our cerebellum, back here at the back of our head, or the back of our brain. And then, you know, we know that hippocampus, it's what's, you know, that's where that information gets taken in. It comes in, you know, our hippocampus is involved in helping the neurons take in that information and coding it, turning it into something useful and meaningful. And it also helps with connecting, I can't remember if I just said it, associating and connecting to other memories. It helps with that memory consolidation and just transforming those new memories into long-term memories. And then if this is interesting, if the hippocampus gets damaged, people can't create more long-term memory, so they kind of always live in the present. And what's kind of funny about that, or they live in the present, or maybe kind of live in the past. Think of that Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore movie, 50 First Dates. Kind of, you know, amnesia. Think about things like that. So if we have damage to our brain, you can't create those long-term memories. You know, you can't take any more information in, so you're not learning anything. That's a very specific type of amnesia, and like kind of the worst. But what's interesting about that is that the memories that the hippocampus have already formed, you know, they will stay there. So pretty interesting stuff there. And then the amygdala. So another big part, another big thing at play and our memories is the limbic system, our emotions, right? We know that has a lot to do with our emotions. So we see the amygdala come into play here. And that's just, you know, our amygdala, that's kind of one of those basic primal parts of our brain, because that's where those, those natural, the fight or flight response comes from. So, it helps regulate those emotions, those fear, aggression, and it's what helps us process and consolidate emotion. I was going to say emotional memories, but it's kind of true. When we look at the human, when we look at the mind-body connection, guys, we actually find that it's not dualistic. It's actually a triad, because we also have these things called emotions, and they affect how we think and how we behave too. The thing with the thing with it is, though, that we're not quite sure what comes first. Does the emotion create the thought that creates the behavior, or does the thought create the emotion, create the behavior? That's kind of cognitive behavioral theory there. But we do know that, once again, with mental disorders and treating things like addiction, cognitive behavioral therapy is about taking that triad, helping people, take their negative thoughts, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, and turn those into something that are more positive and productive, or something more serving for that people. And so when it comes to this kind of emotional memory processing and consolidation that our amygdala does, we call this kind of a flashbulb memory. And basically what it is, I would say, think of it as like, taking a picture. Flashbulb, because that's what, it is kind of referring to the old-timey cameras that had the big old flash bulb, so you knew your picture was going to be taken from that flash there. That light bulb would light up there. So old, very old. And basically that's what it is. So that there's this like kind of picture, that is this emotional picture that is taking that event. And it doesn't always have to be something that's negative. We have those positive flashbulb memories and flashbulb moments too. And like I said, that has to do with that emotional regulation there has to do with our limbic systems too. And then when we're looking at how memories form in our brain, like we said, a lot of it is done through consolidation. And, consolidation is just through that associative process there. And then when it comes to memory formation, we can have something called retrograde amnesia, and that's where you can have amnesia, so you have some damage to the brain that causes you to forget events that occurred before, so you lose memory of your past. And then with anterograde amnesia, that is where you have some kind of damage, and then you don't remember events that happened after. Now that would be with 51st dates, because she has the accident there, and then she always wakes up living in the same day because she doesn't remember, the next day starting. And then we break down, there are actually 5 or 6 different types of specific amnesias, but we will save that for another lecture. And electroconvulsive shock, a shock therapy treatment. This is something that prevents memories from getting established in our brain, because you're electrocuting your brain. Our brain already works on those electrochemical connections, right? And so you're just adding more electricity to that. Electroshock treatment used to be really big and popular in psychology, to use for people with mental disorders. It's very rarely used now, because it really just it scrambles people's brains, and it may scramble them enough to where a person acts right for maybe a few weeks, but they eventually go back into those abnormal behaviors, and then you get your brain shocked enough times, it really messes with you. Alright, and then when it comes to memory, we have photographic and eidetic memory. So photographic is just that, is, we tend to think a lot in pictures, and so, that's just when we recall a memory and it is like a picture in our head or like a movie in our head. That's the photographic. Some people are really good at that. They have better photographic memories than others. We have eidetic, and and that's pretty much where you can remember everything. It's like you see something and you remember every single detail about it. Those are like those people who, they read a book one time and they remember everything in the book. And that seems to be more somebody does that more when they're a kid. And I think it's because, our brain's still developing. So, and it doesn't have as much information in there already. So it's a lot easier, to be able to focus on the present and recall information clearly. And so we usually see that fade when they go into adulthood. But like I said, there are examples of people who have savant memory where they can remember everything that has ever happened to them in their life. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine having to remember everything that ever happened in my life. I think it just, good or bad, it would just drive me crazy to have to always be thinking of all of that, But like I said, there are some people who can do that. We call them savants. And my mentor in archaeology, I'm pretty sure she was a savant. She was eidetic memory. She was really good at that. So, ways to improve memory. Of course, we said, elaborative processes, making those connections, making those association. Another way that we improve our memory is by selection. So, we just find one important aspect of that information to memorize. Then, of course, like we said, we have that idea of schemas, idea of chunking. And then we have whole learning versus part learning. And so with whole learning, you're studying largest meaningful amounts of information at one time, whereas with that part learning or progressive part method there, you want to break it up so that you're able to retain that information better. And then once again, we have that what we call the serial position. There is, when we tend to remember the beginning and the end. To remember the beginning, it's best. To remember the middle, it's best if we kind of focus more on that middle information. And then, like we said, we can also have things like priming, things like cues that help us remember the information. Then we have things like overlearning, and overlearning is basically, so say you take a class and you're interested in that subject and the class ends, and then you keep studying that information. We have space practice, and this is it's much better when you're studying, especially for things like school. When you're studying for tests, it's way better to break it up into short little periods. Rest your brain, rest your eyes, come back to it. When you're writing papers, long research papers, write a little bit at a time, take a break. Let yourself rest. Let your brain, take its break, do its encoding and all of that processes, and then go back to it. That's much better than trying to sit down all at one time and tackle it. Breaking it up is always breaking it up into those useful chunks, useful smaller chunks. It makes it much easier to remember. And then, of course, retrieval practice, those things we talk about, like those rehearsal type strategies. You can even do that with your long-term memory. And so, sometimes we study by reciting the information, and we say knowledge of result lets you check your process. I would say that would be like maybe we test ourselves on it. I like to make note cards, and usually if I make note cards, I have like a question or a definition on one side, and then the answer on the back, and that's really a good way to study. That always helps me a lot. And then along those lines too, then review, so if you learned something, go back and look over it. There is this idea that if you want to remember something before you go to sleep, read it like 3 to 5 times, read over it, and then forget about it, go to sleep, wake up in the morning, read over it again first thing in the morning, like 1 or 2 times, and during the night it's kind of like an osmosis type thing, is that, you know, it's that does help you to retrieve that information better if you do it right before you go to sleep and then wake up. That seems to be, that memory is pretty easy to recall. It's pretty fresh in your brain still. And then they're just, you know, any kind of strategy that you can use to recall that information. So, you know, there are different types of mnemonic devices that people use, or, you know, just whatever little, like, planned out thing you can do to help your brain, you know, go down that neural pathway to that memory or that information you're trying to call. And then when it comes to, you know, trying to improve memory, you know, once again, giving yourself those breaks, you know, will extend the how much longer you remember that information. So it's just, you know, it's about lengthening that time between retrieving. So it's like, you know, you remember it 1 day, can you remember it 2 days, just so on. And then, of course, sleep and hunger play a role in our memory. We know that, you know, just being hungry, being sleepy, those are things that distract us, don't keep us in the present. So, you know, it makes it hard to remember information when we are in those, you know, when we're in those states. And then, just like I said, you know, a good system, you know, people use a lot of different little mnemonics to remember. Sometimes, you know, take these mental pictures. Sometimes, you know, you have those little, like little sentences that people make up, so that, you know, each letter of the word in the sentence represents whatever it is you're trying to remember. Or, you know, you have those ones people will be like trying to remember something, and, you know, there's weird ones like, the floor is green, which makes me think about the mountain over here, and then that comes back to where, oh, I hid my key in the shoebox. You know what I'm talking about? How people do that kind of stuff. I don't know how people do that, but you know, we all have our own little tricks there to help us remember something. And it really just comes down to, you know, if you think you have trouble remembering information, find a mnemonic trick that works for you. Maybe sometimes you'll have to play around with a few different ones, but you know, the base of the key there is that whatever works for you is going to be what helps you remember. And then, just like I said, just a couple more little mnemonic tricks here. You know, tell a story. Take a mental path, you know, mental walkway. It's kind of a way to remember where I'm going. I like to do that mental imagery in my head, so I know when I'm driving what I'm looking for and things like that. Because I guess I'm still old school, guys, and I don't rely on my Google Maps. I like to look around and remember signs and take that mental walk of where I'm going to be driving. So, all right, guys, that covers our interesting world of memory. Thanks.